Donnie and Dolly. The team is supported by ableauctions.ca. Closing your business? We can help. And King of Floors, your vinyl, laminate, and engineered flooring superstore.
All of our guests today, including Kevin Woodley, coming up in a matter of moments, sponsored by Skipper Auto, supporting Canadian fishing families through a revolutionary seafood buying experience. Check them out online at skipperauto.com. This couldn't be more perfect, and actually we booked Kevin yesterday, but all this news breaking today in the National Hockey League, a lot of it involving goaltenders, Braden Holtby and Marc-Andre Fleury, to name
Martin Jones,
too, and Martin Jones as well. Kevin Woodley joins us now from NHL.com. At Kevin is in Goal. He also works for In Goal magazine. Kevin, thanks for doing this, sir. How are you?
I'm good. I said yesterday elsewhere that I thought this might be the greatest game of goaltending musical chairs we'd ever seen, between all the lists on free agency, all the names that were, rumored to be on the move, including Fleury, and obviously the expansion draft, and it's all panned out, like maybe even more so than I predicted. And I expect a lot of short-term contracts, guys, and I think this is going to become an annual thing. Enough teams sort of devalue the position that there are very few guys they're willing to lock in and commit to long-term, and I think you're going to see a lot of movement annually, even more so than we've seen in the past, kind of like what we're expecting tomorrow.
So what's changed over the last few years with that, Kevin?
I do think that is, some of this is analytics. Some of the teams that are leading this charge, when you take a look at Carolina, no goaltenders really right now, and shopping in the bargain bin. Teams are looking at build a good defense, and we can find a goaltender to play behind it, or in some cases we can build a goaltender to play behind it. Last 10 years now? I think it's 10 years since a goaltender who wasn't homegrown won a Stanley Cup. So the irony amidst all this movement and interchangeable pieces is the teams that win are the ones that sort of draft and develop their own. It's an interesting juxtaposition, but at the end of the day, and I've had some prominent goalie coaches share this with me, at the expense of it costing me my goalie union card. What would you take if you would take three great centers down the middle, an elite top four on D, or a superstar goaltender? Most goalie coaches will tell you, give me the elite top four defense, and I will find or build you a goaltender that can win behind it. And that seems to be an attitude and a mantra that we're seeing pick up across the league, whether it's the dollars being down, whether this is a reaction to the Bobrovsky contract, just avoiding term, which is always something I've said is a priority. The position changes so fast, and not just who's good at it, but what goalies are expected to do to be good at it, like the way offense changes affects goaltenders, that I would just avoid locking in on anyone. That would be my preference.
But to be on your side as somebody who's a member of the Goaltenders Union, what position is there in sport more than any other that can steal you a big game other than goaltender in hockey?
It's the great irony, Don. Like I said, they're probably coming. I'm expecting a knock at the door any minute, asking for the goalie union card back here. But that is the great irony. How many times have we heard it's the most important position in the sport? They shouldn't call it hockey. They should call it goalie. And yet, continuously, we see the position devalued as a pretty strong statement. But clearly, teams are valuing it differently, and not willing to commit, whether it's term or dollars. Unless it is a guy like Carey Price, a guy like Andrei Vasilevskiy. And in Carey's case, the dollars were too much for Seattle to even have a go at it for nothing. So it has to be sort of a rare exception. And I think part of that is the gap between the top end and the sort of middle. There's a few guys that have a big gap. And then everybody else, it's kind of murky, and it's about fit. And it's about sort of getting a guy at the right moment. And more and more teams are gambling that they can do that rather than over-committing to a guy who has maybe done it with their team, in the short term in the past. Look at the Delkovich trade, right? Like, even there's a homegrown guy that had some success, and they just weren't willing to commit money to him.
Yeah, and he was at, 3.5. His ARB case would have been 3.6 max. Okay, let's get to the big news. Kevin, your thoughts on Holtby being bought out?
Yeah, I guess I thought they might wait to the second window and try and leverage. You've been all over this, Rick, and you know better than anyone that there is some interest out there. Matter of fact, there was a deal last week that they could have pulled the trigger on, but the condition was you had to eat salary, and they weren't willing to. I think you had it today on Twitter. 500 was the most they would eat, and that makes sense. Like I put out a tweet yesterday about sort of the fact that they had a deal, and it was a positive asset coming back the other way, like a position player that's an established NHL player coming back the other way that they could have moved Holtby for. I think it would have been exciting in this market, but they had to eat money, and they need another goaltender. And so if you're eating half of Holtby's contract and you've got to pay in free agency $1.5 to $2 million for a replacement for him, pretty soon you're at, not a loss, but you're not gaining anything. You're not gaining the cap space that they clearly need for other areas. And so it made no sense for them to eat salary on Braden Holtby's deal. And I fully understand it. It would be great if they were in a position where they could have and taken on the asset, but they're just not there in terms of that cap space. So buying him out makes sense. It frees up the most cap room. You don't have to the only downside is it kicks it down the road to next season. And so what does their cap situation look like next year? But for this year, and they're clearly all in on this year and making the playoffs, it did make the most sense. Now, listen, they got to get a replacement. You don't go as all in as they are. And as much as I think Mikey DiPietro might be ready for that shuttle situation that we saw Nashville do with UC Saros, we saw Columbus do with Jonas Korpisalo when Ian Clark was there, where you sort of have a nominal number 2, 3, but the reality is your young kid on a local farm team is playing some games with a big club, practicing with a big club, and then getting all the games played he need by going down to the farm on the weekend and playing like 2 and 3. I think there's some people in the organization that think Mikey might be ready for that, but you can't take a chance, not when you're as all in as they are right now. And so you have to get an experienced insurance policy. So that's part of this equation. Eating Holtby's money was one thing, but having the total of what you ate and what you're going to have to pay the next guy add up to anywhere near what you're paying would have paid Braden next year just made no sense.
Hey, so Kevin, quickly, who's the new backup goalie of the Vancouver Canucks? Who would you go after? A veteran guy? Because you don't want a young guy in there.
No, I don't think it'll be a young guy. I think that, they've had some conversations. I think the guys like Laurent Brossoit is a young guy that might fit. We've seen all the success. He's a local guy. He's played really well against Vancouver. But you're right, Rick. And he's going to be a cheaper deal. But none of the experience that you need. Like, this is more about, clearly they're all in on Demko. And I believe that Michael DiPietro will end up playing games up here and will prove himself ready. But if Thatcher, tweaks a groin or, tweaks an MCL and he's out 4 to 6, you need somebody who can play. So I think a guy like Brossoit probably doesn't have enough experience to fit that. He'll also have a lot of other suitors. I think you're shopping more along the lines of, maybe James Reimer. I think there's been conversations there. And I think guys like Reimer who were sort of 3.5, 3.4 last year are going to be looking at 2 to 2.5 this year on the open market. There is other interest in him. That's a name. Yaroslav Halak is one other people have said. I'm kind of curious. I think Curtis McElhenny might be done. He won the last 2 Stanley Cups purely as a backup in Tampa Bay, and his numbers really took a beating this season in particular. But again, who knows how much COVID played a role. The thing about Curtis to keep in mind, I don't think he has played well enough in the past 2 years to be a strong consideration. But don't forget, Curtis McElhenny thought his career was over. He revived it under Ian Clark in Columbus. There's a relationship there. And so if Ian thinks he can get him back to a certain level, certainly there's a ton of experience there. He's just 2+ years removed from playing very well for Carolina when they needed him, helping them get into the playoffs. And so if they believe they could get him back on track, he would certainly be a buy low option. But I've also heard some rumblings he could outright retire. So we'll see where that leads.
23.5 seconds or less. Marc-Andre Fleury may or may not be going to Chicago. How much game has he got left?
He's the reigning Vezina Trophy winner. He was hands down the ClearSight Analytics. I have access to the proprietary numbers. He was the best goalie, deserving. Should have won the Vezina. Glad he did. So clearly he can play. And I know Vegas has big names on D. and sort of good defensemen, but they are not a good defensive team. He carried them last year. They don't even get out of the first round of the playoffs if not for his performance the first 4 games. He can still play 100%. Problem is the cap hit, and if he doesn't want to play in Chicago, it'll be interesting to see if Chicago was willing to eat some money and move him to a contender.
Right.
Wow, would I love to see him finish his career that way.
Kevin, above and beyond, thanks so much, sir. All the best.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me.